The autumn of 1972 painted the small Pennsylvania town in shades of amber and rust. Inside the Riverside Karate Academy, the sound of bare feet shuffling across worn wooden floors mixed with the sharp crack of focus strikes hitting heavy bags. Master Kenji Yamamoto watched his evening class practice their kata, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning each student with the precision of a craftsman examining his work. The dojo occupied the second floor of an old brick building that had once housed a textile factory. Like many martial arts schools of the era, it was a modest space with peeling paint on the walls and a single American flag hanging beside a smaller Japanese flag near the entrance. The late afternoon sun streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the training area where 20 students moved in synchronized patterns. Among them stood 17-year-old Tommy Rodriguez, whose family had moved to town when his father found work at the steel mill. Tommy's white belt seemed to glow against his dark skin as he struggled through the basic movements of Heian Shoden. His technique was rough, unpolished, but Master Yamamoto had noticed something in the boy's eyes during his first week of training. A hunger, a desperate need to prove himself worthy of something greater than the circumstances that had brought his family north from Puerto Rico. In the corner of the dojo, 60-year-old Frank Mueller quietly swept the floors with methodical precision. His janitor's uniform was clean but faded, and his thick-rimmed glasses reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. Frank had been cleaning the building for 3 years, arriving each evening at 6 o'clock sharp, just as the advanced students were finishing their training session. He worked silently, moving around the edges of the room like a ghost, invisible to most who came and went. But Frank was not truly invisible, not to everyone. Master Yamamoto had been one of the wave of Japanese instructors who came to America in the late 1950s and early 60s to spread the art of karate. He had studied under Gichin Funakoshi himself in Japan before the war, and had spent years refining his understanding of not just the physical techniques, but the deeper principles that made karate more than mere fighting. When he established his dojo in this industrial town, he brought with him the traditional values of respect, discipline, and quiet observation that had been passed down through generations of martial artists. It was this quality of observation that allowed him to notice what others missed. Like the way Frank's eyes followed the movements of the students as they practiced, how the older man would pause in his sweeping when someone executed a particularly difficult technique, the subtle way Frank's shoulders would shift, as if his body wanted to mirror the motions he was watching. Tonight was different, though. As the students bowed out and gathered their street clothes from the small changing area, Master Yamamoto noticed Frank standing motionless near the far wall. The janitor's back was turned, but something in his posture seemed wrong. His shoulders shook slightly, and he had stopped his cleaning routine entirely. The last of the students filed out into the cool October evening, their voices echoing in the stairwell as they discussed their plans for the weekend. Tommy lingered for a moment, adjusting his worn sneakers and folding his uniform with the careful precision Master Yamamoto demanded of all his students, regardless of rank. The teenager glanced toward Frank, but like most 17-year-olds, he was too wrapped up in his own world to notice the older man's distress. Master Yamamoto waited until the footsteps faded completely before approaching Frank. The wooden floors creaked slightly under his bare feet as he crossed the empty dojo. When he reached the corner where Frank stood, he could see the reflection of tears on the man's weathered cheeks in the window glass. "Frank-san," Master Yamamoto said quietly, using the respectful suffix that few Americans understood, but which conveyed a depth of recognition that transcended language barriers. Frank startled, quickly wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Sorry, Master Yamamoto. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I'll finish up and get out of your way." But the karate master did not move aside. Instead, he stood silently, his presence neither threatening nor dismissive. In the traditional way he had learned decades ago in Japan, he simply waited, creating a space where truth might emerge naturally. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither man was sure he should cross. Outside, the sounds of the town settling into evening drifted through the windows. Cars starting in the parking lot below, a mother calling her children in for dinner, the distant whistle of the evening freight train carrying steel from the mills toward the cities, where it would become the bones of skyscrapers and bridges. Finally, Frank set down his broom and turned to face the man who had become the unlikely center of his deepest longing and his greatest shame. Frank's weathered hands trembled as he met Master Yamamoto's patient gaze. The 40-year-old janitor had served in Korea 20 years earlier, returning home to find a world that had moved on without him. His wife had remarried during his extended absence, and the factory job he'd left behind had been filled by younger men with steadier hands and clearer eyes. "Master Yamamoto," Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been watching these classes for 3 years now. Every night, I see these young people learning something beautiful, something that gives them purpose and strength. And I—" His voice cracked, the words catching in his throat like stones. The karate master remained silent, understanding that some truths required their own time to emerge. In the traditional dojos of his youth in Japan, patience was not merely a virtue, but a fundamental principle. The art of waiting, of creating space for another person's authentic self to surface, was as crucial as any physical technique. Frank turned back toward the window, watching the last light of day fade over the industrial landscape. "I was 17 once too, you know, had dreams bigger than this town, bigger than the steel mills and the factory work. But life has a way of grinding those dreams down until all that's left is survival." In the corner of the dojo, Frank's cleaning supplies sat abandoned. His mop bucket, the same industrial grey as the town's winter sky, reflected the overhead lights like a pool of captured stars. The smell of floor wax and disinfectant had become as familiar to him as his own breathing, marking the boundaries of a life that had contracted to these evening hours of quiet observation. "When I first started working here," Frank continued, "I thought karate was just another way for young men to prove themselves, like the boxing matches down at the American Legion, or the pick-up basketball games behind the high school. But watching you teach these kids, especially the ones like Tommy Rodriguez, who come in here carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders." Master Yamamoto stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. At 55, he had spent the last 15 years of his life dedicated to bringing the true spirit of karate to America. Not the flashy demonstrations that were becoming popular in movies and television shows, but the deeper discipline that had sustained him through the hardships of post-war Japan and the challenges of establishing himself in a foreign culture. "You see something in the training that others miss." "Frank-san," Master Yamamoto said softly, "this tells me you understand the true nature of karate. It is not about the techniques alone." Frank turned, surprise flickering across his face. In 3 years of quiet coexistence, Master Yamamoto had never spoken to him at such length, never acknowledged the attention Frank paid to the classes with anything more than a polite nod. "I see the way you watch when we practice kata," the master continued. "Your body responds to the movements even though you stand still. You understand that kata is not merely choreography, but a conversation with invisible opponents, a meditation in motion that builds character as much as it builds skill." The older man's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. Not the tears of regret that had started this conversation, but something deeper, more complex. Hope mixed with fear, longing tempered by the harsh practicality of a man who had learned not to expect too much from life. "Master Yamamoto, I'm 40 years old. I clean floors for a living. I'm not exactly karate student material." The Japanese instructor smiled, an expression that transformed his usually serious face. "In Japan, we have a saying, Nana korobi ya oki. Fall 7 times, rise 8. Age is not what determines a person's worthiness to study karate. Character is what matters. Determination. The willingness to begin again, no matter how many times life has knocked you down." Outside, the town was settling into its evening rhythms. Shift workers were heading home from the mills, their faces blackened with honest soot, their lunch pails empty, their thoughts already turning toward the simple pleasures of dinner with family, and perhaps a cold beer while watching Walter Cronkite deliver the evening news. It was 1972, and America was grappling with questions about Vietnam, civil rights, and its own identity, but in small industrial towns like this one, life still moved to the older rhythms of work and rest, struggle and small victories. Tommy Rodriguez's family apartment was 6 blocks away, where his mother was probably setting the table for a dinner of rice and beans, stretching the family budget to make sure her son could afford the monthly dojo fees. The teenager didn't know that Frank had overheard him asking Master Yamamoto if he could work extra hours sweeping the dojo to reduce his tuition costs. Frank had said nothing, but the boy's quiet dignity had stayed with him for weeks. "What would the other students think?" Frank asked, voicing the fear that had kept him silent for so long. A 40-year-old janitor training alongside teenagers and college students? Master Yamamoto's expression grew thoughtful. In traditional Japanese dojo, we had students of all ages training together, grandfathers learning alongside their grandsons, businessmen training next to farmers. The dojo was a place where society's usual divisions fell away, where only dedication and respect for the art mattered. He gestured toward the empty training space, where the last echoes of bare feet and focused breathing still seemed to linger in the air. True karate is not about impressing others or fitting into their expectations. It is about finding your own path to strength and understanding. Some find it at 17, like young Tommy. Others discover it at 40 or 50 or even later. Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his work shirt, leaving damp streaks on the faded fabric. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him that he had almost forgotten existed. A sense of possibility, a whisper of the dreams he had buried under decades of disappointment and practical compromise. "Would you really consider teaching me?" he asked, his voice carrying the tentative hope of a man who had learned to expect rejection but couldn't quite stop himself from asking anyway. Master Yamamoto bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that bridged the gap between their different worlds. "Frank-san, it would be my honor." 2 weeks later, the November air carried the first hint of winter through the dojo windows. The regular evening class had ended an hour earlier than usual, and Frank stood at the edge of the training area wearing a borrowed white GI that hung loose on his lean frame. Master Yamamoto had quietly arranged for him to begin training during a private session, understanding that Frank's pride and decades of accumulated self-doubt would need careful nurturing. The empty dojo felt different in the stillness. Without the energy of 20 students moving through their routines, Frank could hear every creak of the old wooden floors, every whisper of wind through the window frames. The single bare bulb that Master Yamamoto had left burning cast long shadows across the training space, making it feel both intimate and vast. "Frank-san," Master Yamamoto said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he used with all his students, regardless of age or rank. "Before we begin with any physical techniques, we must understand what karate truly is. In Japan, we call it karate-do. The do means way or path. It is not merely about fighting or self-defense. It is about developing the whole person." Frank nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. At 40, he had learned to be suspicious of grand promises and philosophical abstractions. Life had taught him that most things were simpler and harder than people liked to pretend. But something in Master Yamamoto's steady presence made him willing to listen. "First lesson is always the same," the master continued, moving to the center of the dojo. "We learn to bow. In Western thinking, bowing might seem like empty ceremony. But in karate, the bow is where everything begins and ends. It is respect for the dojo, respect for the art, respect for your training partner, and respect for yourself." Master Yamamoto demonstrated the formal standing bow, his hands at his sides, his back straight but not rigid. The movement was simple but carried a quality of mindfulness that transformed it into something more than mere politeness. When you bow, you leave the outside world behind. Your worries about work, about money, about what other people think of you. For this time, there is only the training. Frank attempted to mirror the bow, feeling awkward and self-conscious. His work boots seemed too heavy, too clumsy for the sacred ground of the dojo. But Master Yamamoto nodded approvingly, making no comment about Frank's civilian clothes or his uncertain movements. "Good. Now we learn the first stance, Mushin-dachi, natural stance." Master Yamamoto positioned his feet shoulder-width apart, his posture relaxed but alert. In karate, everything begins with proper stance. Your foundation must be solid before you can build anything else upon it. As Frank struggled to find the correct position, the master quietly adjusted his feet, his shoulders, the alignment of his spine. Each correction was gentle but precise, and Frank found himself remembering his army training 20 years earlier. The attention to detail, the understanding that small things done correctly would eventually lead to larger successes. "Master Yamamoto," Frank said during a brief rest, "can I ask you something? Why are you really doing this? Taking time to teach someone like me, I mean. You could spend these hours with your advanced students, the ones with talent and potential." The Japanese master was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal history that Frank recognized from his own life. "When I was a young man in Japan after the war, Everything was destroyed. My dojo, my teacher's dojo, even the spirit of many people. I thought karate might die with the old generation. He gestured around the modest training space with its peeling paint and worn floors. But karate survived because people like you, Frank-san, people who had seen hardship and disappointment, found in it something worth preserving. Not the young athletes looking for trophies, not the ones seeking easy victories, the ones who understood that true strength comes from continuing when everything seems hopeless. Frank felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of self-doubt that had lived there for decades. The master's words weren't empty encouragement or false flattery. They were recognition of something real, something that Frank had almost forgotten he possessed. Now, Master Yamamoto continued, we learn first kata, Taikyoku Shodan. It means first course or beginning kata. Every technique in this form is basic, but performed correctly with proper spirit. It contains everything you need to understand about karate. The kata was indeed simple, a series of blocks and punches performed in a predetermined pattern, turning 90 degrees at specific points to face imaginary opponents from all directions. But as Frank struggled through the movements, he began to understand what Master Yamamoto meant about basics containing everything. Each block had to be performed with proper timing, correct distance, appropriate power. Each punch required coordination of the entire body, not just the arms. Do not think about perfection, the master advised, as Frank grew frustrated with his clumsy execution. Think about sincerity. The kata is not performance for others to judge. It is conversation between you and the techniques, between your current ability and your future potential. By the end of the hour-long session, Frank's borrowed GI was soaked with sweat despite the cool November air. His muscles ached in ways they hadn't since his army days, but it was a good ache, the kind that spoke of effort and purpose rather than mere labor. As they bowed to conclude the lesson, Master Yamamoto handed Frank a white belt. The belt was plain cotton, nothing special, but as Frank held it in his hands, it felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibility and responsibility. Frank-san, the master said, next week, if you wish to continue, you will join the regular class. Tommy Rodriguez and the other students. They will see that karate is not just for the young, not just for those who have never failed or doubted themselves. They will see that courage sometimes looks like a 40-year-old janitor who decides to begin again. Frank nodded, unable to trust his voice. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the night shift whistle at the steel mill called men to work. But inside the dojo, surrounded by the lingering echoes of centuries-old tradition, Frank felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he belonged. The white belt in his hands represented not an ending or a beginning, but a continuation of something that had started 3 years earlier when he first began watching the classes with hungry eyes. Something that had been interrupted by war and disappointment and the grinding necessities of survival, but had never truly died. Tomorrow, he would return to mopping floors and emptying trash cans. But tonight he was a karateka. Tonight he had found his way back to the dreams he thought he had lost forever. The following Tuesday evening marked Frank's first regular class at the Riverside Karate Academy. He arrived 15 minutes early, his new white GI pressed and folded in a small gym bag that had belonged to his father. The November air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the sounds of the steel mill's evening shift change echoed across the town like a familiar lullaby. Inside the dojo, Master Yamamoto was already preparing for class, arranging the training equipment with the methodical precision that had become as natural to him as breathing. He looked up as Frank climbed the stairs, noting the mixture of determination and anxiety that played across the older man's weathered features. "Frank-san," Master Yamamoto said with a slight bow, "you are early. This shows respect for the training." Frank changed into his GI in the small bathroom that served as a changing area, his hands trembling slightly as he tied the white belt around his waist. The cotton fabric felt foreign against his skin, so different from the work clothes that had been his uniform for the past 3 years. When he emerged, he found Master Yamamoto waiting with a patient smile. "Tonight, you will learn alongside the other students," the master explained. "Some may wonder why a man of your age begins karate training now, but you will show them that the spirit of karate belongs to anyone willing to embrace it with sincerity." The first students began arriving at 6:30. Tommy Rodriguez was among them, his white belt now showing the wear of several months of regular training. The teenager's technique had improved noticeably since Frank had first observed him, his movements more confident, his stances more stable. Behind him came Sarah Chen, a college student whose parents had emigrated from Taiwan, and Mike Sullivan, a 22-year-old mechanic whose calloused hands spoke of honest work. Their conversation stopped when they noticed Frank standing in the corner, dressed in a gi and wearing a white belt. The silence wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of unspoken questions. In 1972, it was unusual for a 40-year-old man to begin martial arts training, especially one whose face they recognized from his quiet presence as the building's janitor. Master Yamamoto called the class to attention with a sharp clap of his hands. Tonight we welcome new student. Frank Mueller has decided to begin his karate journey. In Japan, we believe that learning has no age limit, only the willingness to grow matters. The class bowed in unison, and Frank found himself swept into the familiar rhythm of warm-up exercises. His body protested at first, muscles that had been trained for manual labor struggling to adapt to the precise movements that karate demanded. But gradually, the repetitive motions began to feel less foreign. When Master Yamamoto called for kata practice, Frank took his place at the back of the group. The other white belts moved through Taikyoku Shodan with varying degrees of proficiency, but Frank's execution was noticeably more careful, more deliberate. His movements lacked the fluid grace that would come with time, but they carried a quality of mindfulness that impressed the watching instructor. Tommy Rodriguez glanced back during a brief rest period, his young face showing curiosity rather than judgment. During the water break, he approached Frank with the direct manner that was natural to teenagers who hadn't yet learned to hide their thoughts behind social conventions. "Mr. Mueller," Tommy said, "I've seen you watching our classes for a long time. What made you decide to start training?" Frank considered the question, aware that his answer would set the tone for his relationship with the younger students. "I suppose I realized that watching something beautiful wasn't the same as being part of it," he said finally. "And at 40, I figured it was time to stop watching my life from the sidelines." The teenager nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "My dad says it takes more courage to begin something when you're older, because you have more to lose if you fail." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Frank replied, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The remainder of the class passed more comfortably. During partner exercises, the younger students showed Frank the same patience and respect that Master Yamamoto had demonstrated. Sarah Chen helped him adjust his blocking technique, while Mike Sullivan offered quiet encouragement when Frank struggled with the timing of combination movements. But it was during the final meditation period that Frank truly understood what he had found. As the class knelt in seiza, the traditional sitting position, Master Yamamoto led them through a few minutes of quiet reflection. In the silence, Frank could hear the familiar sounds of the town settling into evening routines, but they seemed distant now, separate from the peaceful space he occupied within the dojo walls. When the class ended with the traditional bow, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the satisfaction of completing a job well done, which he knew from his work, but the deeper fulfillment that came from challenging himself to grow. It was a feeling he remembered from his youth before the war, before disappointment had taught him to expect less from life. As the students gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Tommy approached Frank again. "Mr. Mueller, if you want, I could stay after class sometimes and help you practice the basic kata. I remember how hard it was when I started." The offer carried no condescension, only the genuine desire to help that Frank recognized as one of the fundamental values Master Yamamoto worked to instill in his students. "I'd appreciate that, Tommy," Frank said, surprised by the thickness in his own voice. After the other students had left, Frank helped Master Yamamoto secure the training equipment and turn off the lights. It was a routine he had performed hundreds of times as the building's janitor, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just maintaining the space where others trained. He was caring for his own dojo, protecting the place where he was learning to rediscover himself. "Frank-san," Master Yamamoto said as they prepared to lock up, "you showed great spirit tonight." The other students saw this. They understood that karate is not about age or previous experience, but about the courage to begin again. Frank nodded, still processing the evening's experiences. The physical training had been challenging, but the greater victory was internal. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming the part of himself that had been buried under decades of compromise and resignation. As they walked down the stairs together, Master Yamamoto added quietly. Next week, we begin learning about the deeper principles of karate. Not just the techniques, but the philosophy that gives them meaning. You are ready for this learning, Frank-san. Your life has already taught you much about perseverance and dignity. Now we will show you how these qualities become strength. Outside, the November night was clear and cold, with stars visible despite the glow from the mill's smokestacks. Frank walked to his old Ford pickup truck with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring the familiar routines of maintenance work and quiet service. But tonight, he carried with him the knowledge that he was more than his circumstances had led him to believe. The white belt tied around his waist felt like a promise rather than a symbol, a promise to himself that growth was still possible, that dreams deferred were not necessarily dreams destroyed, and that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simple decision to stop watching from the sidelines and step onto the path. 6 months had passed since Frank's first regular class at the Riverside Karate Academy. The harsh Pennsylvania winter had given way to spring, and the dojo's windows were open to let in the warm May evening air. Frank's movements had transformed from the hesitant, uncertain gestures of a beginner to the more confident, deliberate actions of a student who understood the deeper rhythms of karate training. His white belt was no longer pristine. It carried the honest stains of sweat and effort, the fraying edges that spoke of months of tying and untying, of countless hours spent in pursuit of techniques that seemed simple, but revealed endless layers of complexity. Master Yamamoto had mentioned that Frank would soon be ready to test for his yellow belt, a milestone that would have seemed impossible during those first awkward weeks. The evening class was working on kumite, controlled sparring exercises that required students to apply their techniques against moving opponents. Frank had initially struggled with this aspect of training, his 40-year-old reflexes slower than those of his younger classmates. But gradually, he had learned to compensate for speed with timing, to rely on positioning and distance rather than raw athleticism. Tommy Rodriguez had kept his promise to help Frank with extra practice sessions. The teenager's own skills had improved dramatically over the months. His natural athletic ability, now supported by the discipline and focus that Master Yamamoto worked to instill in all his students. But more importantly, Tommy had developed the patience and teaching ability that marked him as someone who truly understood karate's deeper principles. Tonight, however, something was different in the dojo's atmosphere. Master Yamamoto seemed more contemplative than usual. His attention focused not on the technical details of the techniques being practiced, but on the interactions between his students. Frank noticed the way the instructor's gaze lingered on him during breaks in the training, as if evaluating something beyond mere physical progress. After the formal class ended and most students had left for the evening, Master Yamamoto asked Frank and Tommy to remain behind. The two unlikely training partners waited respectfully, as their instructor arranged 3 chairs in a circle near the center of the empty dojo. Frank-san, Tommy-san, Master Yamamoto began, using the respectful honorific that had become natural to him over the years. Tonight, I want to share with you a story from my own training in Japan, before the war changed everything. The master's voice carried a weight of memory that both Frank and Tommy recognized. They had heard fragments of his personal history during classes, but this felt different, more intimate and deliberate. When I was a young student, perhaps Tommy's age, I was very proud of my technique, very concerned with impressing my sensei and my fellow students. I practiced kata for hours, seeking perfection in every movement. But I was training for myself, for my own advancement, not understanding that karate's true power comes from what we give to others. Master Yamamoto paused, his eyes distant as he recalled events from decades past. There was an elderly man in our dojo, old enough to be my grandfather. He had begun training late in life, after retiring from his work as carpenter. The younger students, myself included, sometimes smiled at his efforts. His techniques were slow, his stances imperfect by our standards. Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, recognizing himself in the description. But Master Yamamoto's next words surprised him. One evening, this elderly student collapsed during training. Heart attack. While we younger students stood frozen, not knowing what to do, he used his remaining strength to perform one perfect kata, Taikyoku Shodan, the same kata Frank-san has been learning. Every movement was executed with complete sincerity, complete commitment to the principles we had all been studying. The master's voice grew softer, more reverent. My sensei told us later that this was true karate, not the flashy techniques or the competitive victories, but the spirit that transforms ordinary movements into expressions of character and courage. The elderly student survived and continued training until his death many years later. But that night taught me that karate's greatest gift is not what it makes us capable of doing, but what it makes us willing to become. Frank and Tommy sat in respectful silence, understanding that they were receiving a teaching that went far beyond technique or tradition. This was personal philosophy earned through decades of observation and practice. Frank-san, Master Yamamoto continued, turning his attention to the older student. When you began training 6 months ago, you believed you were too old, too set in your ways to learn karate, but you have shown our entire dojo something more valuable than perfect technique. You have shown them that growth never stops, that dignity comes not from avoiding failure, but from continuing to try. The master gestured toward Tommy. And Tommy-san, you have learned to teach, to share your knowledge with patience and respect. This is how karate traditions survive, not through individual achievement, but through the willingness to help others find their own path to understanding. Frank felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, but they were different from the tears Master Yamamoto had witnessed that first evening months ago. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, that his life had been fundamentally altered by the simple decision to stop watching from the sidelines. Master Yamamoto, Frank said quietly, I need to tell you something. That first night when you found me crying in the dojo, I wasn't just sad about missed opportunities. I was ready to give up on everything. My job, my life in this town, maybe life itself. I felt like I had become invisible, like nothing I did mattered to anyone. The admission hung in the air like incense, sacred and honest. Tommy's young face showed the gravity of someone receiving a confidence that would stay with him for years to come. But you saw me, Frank continued. You saw something worth teaching, worth investing time and patience in. And through karate, I've learned that being invisible isn't the same as being worthless. Sometimes the most important victories happen where no one else can see them. Master Yamamoto bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that acknowledged Frank's courage in sharing his truth. Frank-san, you were never invisible to those who knew how to look. Your dedication to maintaining this dojo, your quiet service to our community, your willingness to begin again when others would have accepted defeat. These things have always been visible to eyes trained to see character rather than circumstances. The three men sat together in the growing dusk, surrounded by the tools and traditions of an ancient art that had somehow found its way to a small Pennsylvania town in 1973. Outside, the sounds of evening shift changes at the steel mill provided a familiar backdrop to their conversation. But inside the dojo, time seemed suspended in a moment of perfect understanding. Tommy broke the silence with a question that revealed his own growth over the months of training. Master Yamamoto, will Frank-san eventually become a black belt? Will he be able to teach other students someday? The master smiled, an expression that carried both wisdom and affection. Tommy-san, in karate, we say that every black belt is simply a white belt who never gave up. Frank-san has already begun teaching, though he may not realize it. Every time he shows up for class, every time he demonstrates that learning has no age limit, every time he helps a younger student understand that courage comes in many forms, he is teaching all of us what karate truly means. Frank looked down at his worn white belt, understanding for the first time that its color was less important than what it represented. The belt was a symbol of beginning, of the willingness to start again, of the humility that makes growth possible. Whether it eventually changed color mattered less than the daily choice to continue showing up, to keep learning, to remain open to transformation. As they prepared to close the dojo for the evening, Master Yamamoto placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. Frank-san, you asked me once why I chose to teach you. Tonight I will tell you, because in 40 years of teaching karate, I have learned that the greatest privilege is not training the naturally gifted, but witnessing the moment when someone discovers their own inner strength. You have given me that gift, and it is unforgettable. The three men bowed to each other and to the dojo itself, honoring the space where transformation had occurred quietly, steadily, one class at a time. Outside, the spring evening was alive with possibility, and Frank walked to his truck knowing that he had found something far more valuable than martial arts technique. He had found himself again, and in doing so, had helped others find pieces of themselves they didn't know they were looking for. The janitor who had once wept in a corner of the dojo had become something he never expected. A teacher, an inspiration, and a living reminder that the most unforgettable moments often begin with the simplest decision to try again.